to California Community. Awesome. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to California Community Builders' inaugural webinar, Multifamily Homeownership, Pathways to Addressing the California Housing Crisis. My name is Adam Briones, and I'm CEO of California Community Builders and one half of our presenters today. Today's webinar is based on our recently released report by the same name, which you can find on our website at ccbuilders.org under research. Before we begin our presentation today, I want to quickly welcome up my great colleague, Dr. Alex Schafran. Producer Tracy, can you bring Alex up on the stage? Awesome.
Hello.
Hey, Alex, how you doing?
Good to see you.
Good to see you. So for those that don't know Alex, not only was he the lead author of our report, but he has an amazingly impressive background on this topic and many other housing issues. In the past, Alex, he's a native Californian. He received his PhD from UC Berkeley in city and regional planning. He taught geography at the University of Leeds and urban studies and policy, and I know I'm mispronouncing this, at Sciences Po Paris and other universities in France. He's the author of 2 books and is currently a visiting scholar at the Institute of Metropolitan Studies at San Jose State University. Lastly, Alex is founder of the consulting firm aptly named Schafran Strategies. Alex, before we get started on the formal presentation, would you mind sharing a few words on what your vision is for your work and how today's topic fits in?
Thanks, Adam. It's wonderful to be here. A shout out to DJ Tracy on the ones and twos, and to all of the team that helped build this report. This was a massive team effort, and you're only seeing a few of the talking heads here. So just really appreciate everybody's effort in getting us to this time, and all the folks that helped us out in the world, interviews, answering questions. So I had a kind of a long answer to your question, but Carrie Nicole asked a great question in the chat, in the Q&A, which, by the way, the Q&A is already open, about whether we know of any first-time homebuyer programs or homebuyer programs targeting people, focusing on people of color, that embrace this more expansive notion of homeownership, and that's why we're here. The answer is, partially, I think, Carrie Nicole. I'll write a more full answer in the chat. There are plenty of programs out there that include some of the housing tenures that we define as multifamily homeownership, but especially when we get to the kind of intergenerational housing, the more alternative or affordable programs, my guess is that probably not in most cases. But that's a guesstimate. That's not a scientific analysis of existing homeownership programs and to what degree they embrace multifamily homeownership. But that's a project we'd love to work on. So anybody who gets excited about what we present today, to Carrie Nicole's question, reach out and talk to us.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Alex. And, I think, Producer Tracy, we can probably go ahead and share the PowerPoint. So whenever you're ready. Awesome. Thanks, Producer Tracy. So again, as I mentioned, my name is Adam Briones. I'm CEO of California Community Builders, and my colleague Alex Schafran and I will be giving an overview of the report that CCB published just a couple weeks ago. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to check it out, you can always find it at ccbuilders.org under the research section. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about a few things. One, what is multifamily home ownership and why should you care about the issue? And why should we care about the issue? And then we'll also be discussing, where CCB intends to go with the work and why you should pay attention to it and why we think it's important. But first, like any good nonprofit executive, I'd like to do a short commercial for CCB, which will also hopefully shed some light on why we've decided to take on this work. Next slide, please. So big picture, CCB is a nonprofit public policy organization working to close the racial wealth gap using housing and home ownership as our primary tools. Next slide, please. So under the umbrella of closing the racial wealth gap and increasing home ownership for communities of color, we specifically focus on areas like housing production, or are we building enough homes for all the people that want to live in our communities and our state? Second, we think a lot about small developers of color and how we can support them, and asking questions like, do communities of color get to play a direct role in the growth and evolution of our own neighborhoods? And third, once the homes are built, do BIPOC communities have access to mortgages and the capital needed to purchase those homes? Next slide, please. So now that you know who we are, let me give you a quick overview of what we do. First, and why everyone is here today, we produce original research reports like our publication on multifamily home ownership as well as smaller briefs and articles, all with the aim of educating communities and engaging stakeholders. Next, we advocate. We're advocates. We sponsor bills in Sacramento like AB 1508, which would add home ownership to the statewide housing plan, as well as SB 684, which would make it easier to build small lot homes here in California. And finally, once good laws and policies have been passed, we work to implement them so that communities prioritized on paper are the communities that benefit in reality. And then lastly, recognizing the scope of the problem, we run a leadership development program to ensure that young leaders have the training and skills they need to pick up where we leave off, because I do hope to retire someday. And I want to shout out one of our most recent interns and current Cal Bear, Esther Lee Chen, who played a lead role in the production of this latest report. Next slide, please. So, commercial over. Let me actually talk about what we're here to talk about today, multifamily home ownership, or MHO for short. Since Alex has a PhD and I only have a master's degree, we decided that he would be the one to give a detailed, formal definition of the term. But I do want to share off top that while multifamily home ownership may sound like a dry academic term, it's really a straightforward term for a straightforward concept. It means simply multiple households or families coming together to own a part of the same building. And before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do want to share two foundational data points that drove our decision to work on this issue. Next slide, please. First, while California has the second lowest rate of homeownership overall, it's especially bad for BIPOC communities. While around 63% of white Californians own a home, only about 44% and 37% of Latinos and Black Californians, respectively, own their own homes. And before I move on, I do want to note, as we do note in the report, that we find current home ownership data on the Asian American community to be too broad and too simplistic to accurately reflect the reality of the economically diverse communities that make up that broad category. And we look forward to sharing future disaggregated work with you. Next slide, please. So, because home ownership is the way in which most Americans, especially people of color, build wealth, that home ownership gap has a direct impact on the overall racial wealth gap. Nationally, for every dollar of wealth held by a white family, Latino families only have about 20 cents and Black families only have about 10 cents. Next slide, please. So these systemic and alarming disparities left the CCB team looking for something that can build wealth for our communities, that is naturally more affordable and economically accessible for working families, and also something that would hopefully enable the denser, more climate-friendly neighborhoods we need. Next slide, please. And that's how we came to multifamily home ownership. So with that intro, I'd now like to hand the presentation over to Alex to talk in more detail about the topic. Producer Tracy, can you bring Alex back on? Great. And Dr. Schafran, I'll let you take the wheel from here.
All right. Thank you so much. Now, I apologize that Adam is calling me Dr. Schafran. It's a warning sign for everybody that I am going to do it. This is a bit of a sort of lecture on a cold, gray day in Oakland, California. Apologies. For those of you who are not tuned in for this, this is going to be recorded. So if you're like, I'm not in the mood for a lecture, then you can press pause and come back. Also, we are really excited. This is the beginning of a long journey for us on multifamily homeownership. We're primarily we're super excited to present this report. I'm hoping that we'll find some fellow travelers here in the audience to join us, not just in the policy work, but in the research work moving forward to really advance, I think, some of the key insights that this report tries to bring and some of the real possibilities for California and other places to address their housing crisis more equitably moving forward. And so we'll be having other conversations. We're excited to try to bring in other thought leaders and other partners to have more of a conversational webinar and other kinds of events in the future. But for today, we just wanted to take the moment to try to present the report in very brief form. It's a long report. I'm going to go through basically four main steps today. So first, we're going to try to define multifamily homeownership for you and try to explain what we mean by it. And if at any point in time, especially in the beginning, but if any point in time you have questions, please pop the questions in the Q&A. I have it open on my screen. I will do my best to respond to questions at reasonable points in the presentation. If not, I will try to get to them at the end. And if we don't get to your question at the end, I promise that we'll try to figure out some sort of way to put the answer to your question out in the world. So I'm going to go through the definitions. I'm going to go through 8 reasons why we think that this multifamily home ownership approach is important, and one of which is issues around the racial wealth gap that Adam helped talk about earlier. And then I'm going to talk about all of the varieties of issues and challenges facing multifamily home ownership. Again, one of the things about this report is that we're not saying that this pathway of multifamily home ownership is somehow like the greatest thing and it's always good and always perfect. In fact, that's one of the problems that we have, is that we have all of these tenures and they're not particularly well supported. And so sometimes right now, some of the outcomes for people aren't necessarily good. They could be good if we had the same quality and level of support for multifamily home ownership as we do for certain other housing tenures. And so we'll talk about those issues and challenges, and then we'll talk really about the kind of broad buckets of recommendations. Again, this is a 100-slide report. There's a lot in there. We're really trying to weave together a lot of different pieces of our housing puzzle. And so I won't go through all of the 19 issues and challenges that we identified and all of the numerous recommendations. We're just hoping that we can give you a little bit of a piece and encourage folks to dive in with us, get into the report. Hopefully you'll find something that is of interest to you or your organization or your housing movement or yourself as a potentially somebody who wants to live a bit differently or live in the ways that this report talks about enabling. All right, so let's get cracking. Next slide, DJ. So the most important, and in some ways I think for some folks the most challenging part of understanding what we mean by multifamily home ownership is that it's not defined by the property. It doesn't matter whether the property is a multifamily unit, which could be 2 units or more, or whether it's a classic American single family house. We define multifamily home ownership based on the humans who live in that house and who own that house. Next slide, please. So this is a very kind of technical and legalistic definition. I'm going to try to explain it and then try to explain kind of what things are not in that bucket. So first of all, we're defining multifamily home ownership, and home ownership is based on folks that live there. So if there are 2 or more unmarried and unpartnered adults who live in the property that they own, and at least these owners live on the property, and then there's some sort of shared maintenance of the property in some way. So let me give you a few examples of something that is multifamily home ownership and it is not. So for instance, if there is an extended family living in a single family house in which ownership is, maybe it was the grandmother's house and now the kind of cousins are living in the house and running the house, to us, that is multifamily home ownership. Because if you were to go, could they as a family easily go into a bank and buy the house? Probably not, right? Not under our current system. So we defined it based, again, on these extended families. For instance, I used to live in the UK, and with a friend of mine, we owned a single family home together. He lived in the top half, I lived in the bottom half. We also rented units. That's multifamily home ownership, and that's one of the inspirations for this kind. I'll go through all the other sort of traditional forms of multifamily ownership, like condominiums and community land trusts. But that's the most important thing, is that we define it based on the relationships of the folks who are in the unit and whether they own the unit, and not necessarily based on the type of the unit itself. Another example that falls out of our bucket, though, for instance, is something like a planned unit development. So this is think of a classic gated community where people live in single family homes, often, but they share ownership of the roads, of the golf course, of the swimming pool, and these kinds of things. They may have a homeowners association, which is a classic sign often of multifamily homeownership. Many forms of multifamily homeownership have an HOA, but the presence of a homeowner association is not enough to make it multifamily homeownership. Because for us, the people in this gated community in their single family homes are not really doing anything to share the maintenance of their own housing units. All they're doing is pooling resources to share common things and nothing to do with themselves. If they were attached and living in a building where they're sharing the maintenance of a roof, like in a condominium, again, it may have the same amenities, but it's a shared condominium, maybe there's a shared heating system, that becomes multifamily homeownership. So I hope this is clear. There's more of the definitions in the report. We welcome any sort of digging in. If you're a condo lawyer listening in and you're like, this doesn't quite pass muster, please let us know. Again, as anybody who's worked in trying to make definitions of big, complicated things work, we spend a lot of time at the whiteboard really kind of hammering this out. It's not necessarily a perfect definition, but we think it does the work that we need to do. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what multifamily homeownership means for most of us in sort of normal real estate terms, right? So there are basically for us 3 different types of multifamily homeownership. We have, and these are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, one of these days I will be able to produce this gorgeous Venn diagram that puts all of these things together. The problem is that it's like a 3-dimensional Venn diagram, and I'm not a good enough visualizer to be able to figure this out. So on the one hand, you have what we're calling market rate MHOs. And what these are essentially the kind of core basic legal structures of multifamily homeownership. Many of the other buckets of multifamily homeownership use these same legal structures. The second bucket and I'm going to go through these in more detail. The second bucket are what we call affordable. These are often income restricted. Sometimes they're also very, very intentional, right? So they're not always affordable and deed restricted, but maybe they're a religious community, maybe it's a co-housing group, maybe it's a people with some sort of shared affinity that have kind of created a formal community to live amongst themselves. I like to think of it as intentional communities. Some of the people will identify as alternative forms of housing. Those are more questions of identity. But again, these are often using the same kind of structures as market rate, but they're adding restrictions and requirements around the building in order to target it towards certain beliefs or certain communities. And then the final bucket, as I mentioned earlier, and I think this is one of the areas of the report that I'm most excited about, is what we're calling informal multifamily homeownership. There are a lot of Americans living in homes in which ownership is a bit fuzzy. That there are multiple families living in one house and one of the families kind of formally owns it, but this is essentially multifamily homeownership. With the growth of ADUs and second units, both legal and illegal, that exist now behind the houses, we're sort of realizing and discovering that Americans are living in all of these kinds of ways. And these are especially important for intergenerational households, for sort of larger family compounds, which exist all around the country and have all throughout the American history, right? Again, at times our zoning codes came in and tried to restrict what was done. Oftentimes these types of housing, we tried to make them illegal because they were popular amongst communities of color or amongst immigrant communities. But they're a really important piece of the puzzle. I'm excited to see various folks on this call who I know are interested in this kind of thing. And there are all kinds of ways, again, that people are formally or informally owning homes together. And we're just trying to ask questions about how do people own homes together? What are the things that we can do in the United States in housing policy to make it easier for people to own their homes together? And it doesn't matter whether it's 2 people owning a single family home together or 100 people owning a 100-unit condo together. Both of them are important, both of them for different types of folks at different times of their lives, at different moments in different places, but they're both important and they're both types of multifamily homeownership. So these are the buckets. Let me go through each category really briefly, and then I'll take a pause because I see some questions coming in to the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we get them. So next slide. So again, as I mentioned, in the bucket we're calling market rate, and again, these don't have to be market rate, but again, these are the basic legal structures that govern most multifamily home ownership, and if you don't add in deed restrictions or anything else, then they are market rate. The most common in the United States and in California is the condominium. Right? The condominium is just a basic legal structure in which you actually own the airspace that you live in. You are an owner of that fraction of the house. You pay fees to a homeowners association in which you have a membership that governs the property and pays for all of the common things. This is a very common form, and this is again the most common. You have something called a stock cooperative or a co-op. These are anybody who's lived in New York City. It's probably known with the co-op. They're most popular there. They're not as common in California and most of the rest of the United States. And in this situation, you own a share in the corporation that owns the building, and you essentially rent the unit from yourself, or you have the rights to occupy a certain unit as a result of owning those shares. A very seemingly innocuous technical difference that makes a huge difference when it comes to financing. Banks like one of these, they don't like the other. And that's one of the many issues that I'll come back to when we talk about issues and challenges. Then there's what we call tenancy in common. This is a San Francisco invention to get around land use laws invented in the 1970s. This is essentially, in many ways, the least protected form of common ownership. It's the simplest, but it's also at times hard to finance or hard to insure. Tenancies in common, for instance, again, sometimes the difference is that you in a tenancy in common, you have to, if somebody doesn't pay their dues, you can't put a lien on their share of the unit. You have to take them to court. In a condominium, if somebody doesn't pay their HOA fees, the condominium association has the legal right in the state of California to put a lien on their property. Again, these are similarly small details, but they make a huge difference when it comes to financing and regulation, et cetera. And that's actually one of the big lessons about multifamily home ownership. So forewarned, if you're not interested in the details of housing tenure, this is going to be a report and a space that's going to be challenging because all of these little details really matter. And they're regulated in different ways in different states, at times even in different cities. Each bank and each financing side will have its own opinions about all of these things. When you get to all of the regulation, you get to all of the money stuff, this stuff really, really, really matters. Anybody who's in this part of the housing business understands this. And so this is very much a journey into some deep detail and into the weeds. If you don't like weeds, this is a hard part of housing policy to be in. But if you do like weeds, boy, have we got some really high weeds for you. And again, once you start to get into it, I hope that you find it interesting. And again, I hope that we're able to do things in ways to explain it to make it a little less intimidating. I am not a condominium lawyer. And I'm not a mortgage broker. There are so many levels to this game that are beyond me. And you just have to kind of embrace that complexity. So that's market rate. And again, these are more just the basic legal structures. Next slide, please. There's what we call alternative or affordable, as I mentioned. And so these are often legal structures in the first bucket that have, because of the financing or because of how the land is owned, other restrictions. Now, community land trusts are a very different form of tenure. On their own, community land trusts at their most basic separate the ownership of the land from the ownership of the structure. But the structures themselves can be owned as co-ops, they can be owned as condominiums. Irvine Community Land Trust is building a 68 unit, I believe, condominium structure on its land, very innovative. There's what we call below market rate condos. Oftentimes these are condominiums that are produced as inclusionary housing when developers build a large number of condominium units and they have to give a certain number of units for affordable housing. They're often put under the control of the city or a local nonprofit organization. They are essentially legally a condominium, just like everything else, with a specific deed restriction on those specific units. There's limited equity housing cooperative, which are sort of a cousin of a standard stock cooperative. And again, there are many more that we could continue to go on. But again, in general, this bucket are often those bucket one units with some sort of additional layer of protection, with the separate example being the community land trust. But again, those two things can work together. And this is, again, one of the most important things about multifamily homeownership, and one of the reasons why we wrote the report. You see all of these tenures are really interlocking. They're not mutually exclusive. They can change, they can evolve. And it really makes sense for us to start to think of them together. Traditionally, advocates for home ownership may be focused on condominiums and these market rate, whereas advocates for community land trusts and below market rate condos are part of the affordable housing world. And it's really important to us that people start to see on both the affordable and the market rate side all of these commonalities and all of the ways that these two things interlock. And all of them have the capability of producing both wealth generation and a sense of real control or community control or both over your housing. And so it's time that we really start to see these things as part of the same world of housing and to try to create what currently would be strange bedfellows, but really shouldn't be that strange bedfellows in our housing movement. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about why multifamily homeownership is important, because that's one of the reasons why. Is that I think this approach that we've laid out has the possibility of building political alliances that we've never really truly built in the United States. in ways that can really fundamentally change how we allocate housing, how we build housing, how we own housing, how we buy housing, in ways that if we do want the kind of equity that we talked about, we want the sustainability that we talked about, we're going to have to start moving the chess pieces around the board a little bit more, because in our current political environment, there's just no way we can achieve the reforms to turn any of these numbers around, whether it's our unhoused numbers, whether it's our home ownership numbers, whether it's our tenant being evicted numbers. All of these need a sort of a sea change. And I think that we're providing what seems to be technocratic on its surface, but I think is actually a place where people can come together. So next slide, please. The last bucket, as I mentioned, is the one I'm guessing that many of people on the call are familiar with all three of these in some ways. The first, you might not have thought about condominiums and community land trusts as part of the same ecosystem, and that's one of the things I'm really hoping that people will do. You may also probably are aware of informal friend zoning things together, intergenerational housing, all of these things that don't fit into either a married couple with children or a married couple owning a house, a single family house together, or a bunch of people in a condominium, but all of the ways in which single family homes in the United States have been quietly, at times illegally, at times informally repurposed by all kinds of groups of friends or relatives or just people occupying them into different forms of multifamily homeownership. It's really time that we start to recognize these often as an asset, as an impressive things that people are doing despite the fact that the system doesn't support it. Neither public policy or the financial system or even our building system recognizes some of the ways in which Americans are living, and not just living because they have no choice but to live that way. Again, oftentimes you have sometimes multifamily homeownership is because of there's overcrowding. But oftentimes people would live this way if they could. It's a great way of pooling money. It's a great way of saving money. It's a great way of building wealth. It's a great way of living differently. And we just make it difficult at so many different levels. One of the things that is exciting, I know some of our friends from Frolic are here. They're a new organization, new company that is helping people build condominiums. And one of the things, build co-ops, sorry, Frolic. And again, one of the things I think that's exciting about it is that they're working at a really small scale and approaching even, again, helping, is there a way that we can help to formalize some of the informal tenures if that's what works? And one of the reasons why we call it informal is because I think it also helps us see that, some of the things and practices that exist in the global South, including other parts of the world, are important, that we're realizing that they're here and that they can be really useful to our housing solutions. Not just social housing in Vienna and in Singapore is useful. There are all kinds of other ways of living that I think people are living this way. They can be really useful if they are supported. And that's what Frolic is, and that's what many of you already do, is you're part of the infrastructure that supports our housing system. And we're trying to figure out a way to build a more supportive infrastructure for housing that reaches a whole lot more different types of housing tenure, including folks that are living in this more informal way. And one of the dangers and challenges with informality is that if we come in to formalize and let's say give people deeds or give people legal portions or divide it up so that everybody actually owns a portion in that way, that can often do more harm than good. And so by bringing attention to it, we want people to, in every aspect of multifamily homeownership, it's not like automatically go and do something. It's, hey, let's see it, let's start measuring it, let's start talking about it, let's understand it. And then let's figure out in each individual situation, how do we make that situation more supportive? And how do we make sure that we're doing right by the people that are already living this way and doing right by the people who want to live this way and for whom this is a good opportunity? It doesn't automatically mean more regulation, more financing, more, because that can at times destabilize some pretty fragile situations. Next slide. So I'm going to take a pause here. Are there any questions? If you have any definitional questions, put them in here. The anonymous attendee asks, is social housing like the one in Vienna considering multifamily homeownership? The answer is sometimes yes. So many of the Viennese social housing tenures are some form of limited equity ownership. And in that case, it absolutely would be. Singapore, in fact, in particular, is a predominantly many of the Singaporean social, again, the government owns 80% of the housing or 80% of the population or something like that. 70%, 80%, however you do the math in Singapore, lives in some sort of housing, but in many cases, they own their units as well. So yes, many of the MHO units, and in Alex Lee's AB 309, which just passed the state assembly, congratulations to the assembly member, limited equity home ownership is one of the types of housing tenures that is permitted for the California Housing Authority to build if that bill continues through the Senate and passes. And so yes, that is, I think, particularly important. Again, one of the things about multifamily home ownership is that we're trying to describe the world as it is in many ways. This isn't just an idealized version of what the way the world should be. This is a way of looking at the world and seeing the pieces that we already have in housing and figuring out ways to strengthen them and make them better. And it's also very inclusive understanding and definition that fits most visions of what a good housing future looks like. If you're advocating out there, again, there are ways in which pieces of what multifamily homeownership means. In fact, one of the things I'll talk about in a second is there are ways, many, many ways in which a stronger, larger, and more supportive multifamily homeownership sector will help tenants and renters of all kinds. So thank you for that question, anonymous attendee. So let's go through the kind of quickly the reasons why MHO matters. And this is the part, and I really, if you're, if you want to dive in with us, I think this is a really good place to start, especially if you're, comfortable with the definition. So as I mentioned, this is a way that people are actually living. Like, too often housing policy in the United States gets rendered in really ideological terms about some imagination about how we're meant to live. And just this is an incredibly diverse country. California is an incredibly diverse state. We live in all of these different ways. And we need a housing policy, and we need a reformist housing policy that is rooted in this. So there's a multifamily homeownership works in single family homes, and it works in 500 unit condo buildings and everywhere in between. It can be dense, it can be not dense. It can be, depending on where you are and the type of housing structure. Every house in the United States has the capacity to be multifamily. Every housing unit in California can now, almost every single family home can now have an ADU or a second unit, and there's increasingly possibilities that those could be multifamily home ownership opportunities. Right now, for instance, in the state, you cannot buy the ADU, you can't sell an ADU separately from the main house unless you're a nonprofit. So Habitat for Humanity can do. Oakland Community Land Trust across the street from my house, there's a ADU in it, and that can theoretically be conveyed separately. Folks that are not nonprofits can't do this right now, but there's a bill by Phil Ting in the legislature. I don't hope it hasn't died yet. If it's died today, I'm sorry that I'm a little bit out of date. Oh, it's still alive. Thank you, Celeste Goyer. So still alive, that would enable people to sell an ADU separately. So that's in some ways we mentioned in the report, it's one of the easiest ways to create multifamily homeownership possibilities based on the existing fabric that we have. It's something that is more prevalent in BIPOC communities. Now, unfortunately, our report doesn't have incredible data. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about. And one of the issues with multifamily homeownership is that the data isn't particularly good. We don't ask a lot of questions about housing tenure that are really detailed enough to get at multifamily homeownership. Fortunately, I'm collaborating with some really amazing colleagues at the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank on what will be, I believe, the first and most robust data-centric study of multifamily homeownership in the 9 Western states and the 3 in the Marianas and Guam. And one more I forget. Apologies to whoever I'm missing in the 12th district. And so hopefully at some point in the near future, we'll be able to put some more concrete numbers around who's living in multifamily ownership, do some unit counts by the different types, and really be able to sort of show the relationship between race and homeownership and multifamily homeownership as it currently exists. But again, what we do know from the limited data that we have, especially at the level of the United States, is that it is something that is more prevalent in many communities of color, again, with certain types of variation of all kind. As I mentioned, I think you should be able to continue to hear me. So we don't have great data on it. It's not the kind of thing that people have thought about together. Again, our world of homeownership has been in one place, our world of alternatives and below market rate homeownership has been in another place. we've been divided between these like homeownership ideologies and renter housing, as if these were the only two types of housing. And it's just sort of something that is understudied, and we need to understand it. It's the type of thing that can really help on all different levels with regard to the housing crisis. All of those communities, especially BIPOC communities that were devastated in 2008 in the foreclosure crisis, who are trying to crawl their way back into homeownership, this is a possibility. Multifamily homeownership opportunities are often cheaper, are generally cheaper, again, sometimes because they're smaller, sometimes for other reasons. The multifamily homeownership opportunity that we talk about can be really diverse. Again, if there are more and more ways, imagine, for people to pool their limited resources to be able to buy things together, we just open up the possibility of homeownership, not just for financial reasons, but for all the other reasons. I mean, if you've ever owned a home and if you owned it by yourself, it's an incredibly isolating and difficult and scary experience. Oftentimes, what makes homeownership work for people is that have that partnership, and to be able to do that in community. Again, there are so many ways that we can turn single-family homes into multi-unit buildings, and I think we can really help people across the board. And it's also a way that if we can stabilize homeownership in communities owned by the communities, multifamily ownership works really well with shared equity, which could be shared equity with a government program like California Dream for All. It could be shared equity with a nonprofit. There's so many different ways we can do it. We can actually figure out ways to increase the stock of rental housing, right? More. If this is a way to get more homes owned by people who live locally, that means you're more likely to be renting from a cousin, from a neighbor, from a friend, from somebody in the community, as opposed to trying to make it in the larger rental market. It's a key piece of our land use reform efforts. If we want to take advantage of the duplex and fourplex revolutions, the 80 revolutions, creating more ways that larger groups of people can own these now multi-unit homes together will help drive that, both especially from a demand perspective. Again, it's really expensive to build anything in California, and to assume, to just rely entirely on either the industry or wealthy homeowners or the homeowners themselves to be able to build this. There's all kinds of new ways that we can finance. It's a key pathway for community ownership. If you're a land trust person, if you're a community ownership person, if you're a TOPA COPA person, this is our pathway. Again, this is a very exclusive and expansive. It may be a bit of a challenge to move from believing in one tenure to believing in a wide variety of tenures, but this is the pathway, not just technically in many ways for types of community ownership, but also politically. This is a way that I think that we can build political bridges. And that's one of the things about number 7, right? Number 6 and number 7, community ownership and a unifier and divisive housing policies can go together. If you're a pro-housing YIMBY, this is for you. If you're a community ownership equity person, this is for you. And I think this is also one of the many ways in which we're starting to see bridges being built. Right? I think there's a recognition that when it comes to owning the land, that both are progressive and moderate, or both are pro-housing and pro-equity, however you want to define your sort of sub-tribe. None of us have been paying enough attention, I think, to the intricacies of who owns the land and how it is owned, and what are the political pathways and financial pathways to get us there. And then finally, again, these units are cheaper. That's one of the ways that it's important, but they're not as cheap as they could be. And that's partly because it's really under-supported. One of the ways you save money in housing is if you have all of the housing systems supporting certain pathways, it makes it easier and cheaper. People see less risk. They're more willing to lend money at lower prices. All of the ways that we are able to make things cheaper. So I hope that's clear. I see a couple of questions that have popped in. I'm just gonna, since we're getting a little bit low on time, I'm just gonna run us quickly through the last couple of bits, and then we'll come back in a few minutes to the questions. Next slide, please. So actually, why don't we skip down to slide 20, please. Or actually, make it slide 19. Yeah, there we go. That's perfect. So the majority of the report, and this is something where, again, we're not going to have time to go through everything today. It would put us all to sleep. Is the last 2 slides are really about all of the issues and last 2 sections are all of the issues and challenges, and then a whole slew of different kind of recommendations for moving us forward. And it's hard to illustrate kind of concretely in a short period of time all of the myriad challenges. We come up with 19 different specific challenges, sometimes for very specific types of things. But there's issues with maintenance, with governance, with the deed, with subletting rules. Again, housing tenure is a complicated space. And so I hope it's relatively, I hope the argument of why this makes sense to think about together makes sense, because if it does, there's so much work for us to do together around every level of the detail. And like so many things, again, especially around single family homeownership, we built this very, very intricate system over many generations here in the United States, right? Starting after the war to really advance one type of housing tenure. Same with multifamily rental units. We have one very particular, or two very particular types of system, one for wealthy landlords and one for nonprofit landlords, both very intricate, both very complicated, both very supported in various ways. Undersupported, some would argue undersupported, and I appreciate that. But this is an area where we, again, that same type of system requires us getting into the details. I'm going to go over a couple things really quickly. Next slide, please. So in market rate, again, one of the biggest issues we have where we're not producing a lot of market rate units is that there is something called construction defect law. That means that the builders remain liable if they sell it on. If they keep it as a renter, they're at least maintaining control. And you see a lot of builders get sued at 9.5 years after they build a condominium building. And as long as we don't have either an insurance program or we change that construction liability issue, we're going to struggle. It's generally more expensive to finance the purchase of a condominium than a single family home. It's considered higher risk, and partly because you're taking on the risk of the rest of the building as opposed to just single family units. And we need to figure this out if we're going to make progress. Next slide. When it comes to affordable affordable MHO units, most of the major state funding programs don't universally support the supportive types, right? Community land trust, below market rate condos. Again, most of our programs go either into single family home ownership or multifamily home ownership in certain types of like standard condominiums or into rental buildings, but we don't have a universally supported program, and there isn't a large consistent source of housing to help folks build in this particular way. And the nonprofit housing industry in general hasn't moved as much as it could, I think, to embrace multifamily homeownership within its tenures, and this is part of the challenge. Next slide, please. And finally, with Informal, again, there's just really not a big supply. If you wanted to buy a couple multi-unit building that's existing with your friends, there's not a lot of supply. You may also be in a situation where you're trying to buy a building and you'd have to evict people to live there, and that's not a solution for anybody wants, right? We're not building these new units. It's a very hard challenge to make. And again, so for that reason, the opportunity is mostly in single family homes that we would be converting, but doing that is really expensive and really hard, and in part because, as I mentioned earlier, ADUs and other units, it's generally hard to do. I mean, again, imagine buying a single family house, adding another unit, turning it into a small scale condominium. That's a really difficult, heavy lift. That's huge construction. That's a lot of legal work. And our system isn't set up to support you doing it. I'm a homeowner. I'm in this business. As Adam says, I have a PhD in city planning. I'm trying to do this thing. I promise you it is really hard. And I have all of the things that you would need in general, except for maybe the money, to be able to do it really easily. Next slide, please. So again, that is a taste of, we go through 19 different issues and challenges. I hope we got them right. If you work in one of these areas of MHO and you're like, we didn't get it right, send it to me. If we missed one, either we missed it or we left it out on purpose just because we couldn't fit everything in, please let us know. Please flag it up. We were always struggling between the desire to be comprehensive and the desire to not write a 200-page report. But we do recognize, again, this is a really important part of it. We want to be comprehensive. We are purposely biting off a very big chunk, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to chew. So let's talk about finally recommendations, and then I'm going to try to see if I can answer a couple of Max and Alex and Anthony and Walter's and Elizabeth's questions if I can in rapid fire. So there's two major buckets of work that we need to be able to do. One is research. We simply just don't know enough at any scale. We need the Census Bureau and the Fed to think more about how we gather the data. You should see the kind of data gymnastics we're trying to do with the report. With the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. So we need federal government agencies, we need state government agencies to be able to collect more data. We need the American Housing Survey to be able to be more of a friend of multifamily homeownership than it's currently being. Again, understandable. These were the way we did things for a long time, and now we can do things differently. In California, there are real opportunities for state agencies to also help with the data, but also to really look more at how they interact. And that's actually one of the areas, if you flip over to our other side, which is our sort of policy side, there's an opportunity, I think, in the state of California to create something like an office of multifamily homeownership, something that can coordinate, that can research, that can understand, that can look between the Department of Real Estate and Housing Community Development and Cal HFA and all of the agencies that touch on housing, and ask ourselves, are we building, or do we have a supportive network and a supportive system for the maintenance and production of multifamily homeownership opportunities in California? Right now, we're not quite there, but we do have a lot of the pieces. Again, one of the good news is that I think a lot of the state government agencies and some of the programs are set up well enough that they could adjust, they could adapt, they can be built. We've got many of the pieces that we need to be able to do this and do this right, and that's really exciting. And then there's also a whole slew of very specific questions. Again, this issue I mentioned about condos versus co-ops, and how different financing agencies view this. We don't know enough about what life is like living in informal MHOs. The challenges that informal MHO livers face. The research that we were doing in here isn't nearly comprehensive enough to be able to make some definitive statements, and certainly not comprehensive enough to make good policy, to build a good support network. So again, it's not about regulation, it's about support. And support is sometimes regulation, support is sometimes financing, sometimes it's technical assistance. Support comes in many different kinds. And ultimately, the one-line version of this report is that we need to support multifamily homeownership and define support in a lot of different ways. And I think I will leave it at that. The one other thing in policy that I do want to flag is that when we're talking about policy, we're not just talking about public policy, we're also talking about private policy. There's no way to build a supportive system for multifamily homeownership if the not-for-profit, if the homeownership councils and counselors and not-for-profit organizations, affordable housing developers, if current multifamily rental developers and the market rate rental developers don't switch to building condos, if the banks don't change lending practices to be able to support this. We need private policies. It's the boardrooms need to change in nonprofit sector and in the banks just as much as public policy needs to change, and they need to be able to work together. This is a real call for a type of kind of full industry public-private collaboration to be able to support an entire ecosystem. Again, it's a hyper diverse ecosystem that we're trying to shed some light on and help support. And we'll need an ecosystem-wide approach in order to be able to do this and do this right. Again, like every aspect of housing, we can always do damage when we're trying to do good. And I think that's something that we always kept at the center of our hearts. So I'm going to pause there. Let me take a second to read the questions. Adam, do you want to maybe give them the next steps, and then I'll come in and answer some questions?
Yeah, that sounds great. So we'll go next slide, producer Tracy. Awesome. So good to be back, everybody. And first off, thanks so much for that great presentation, Alex. I knew I made the right decision to ask you to handle the complicated stuff, and you were absolutely the right person to write this report. So really appreciate everything you shared. And I could have listened for another hour on all this stuff. It also sounds like you don't want me to call you Dr. Schafran. So from here on in, we're going to go with the more informal Alex Schafran, PhD. As we get to our last slide before we call it a wrap on this formal presentation, I do just want to quickly share, where CCB is going with this work. And without getting into the details, because I think Alex has already covered a lot, our basic theory of change is we start with the research, and we obviously have our big report coming out on this. We've already published our big report on this year. Next up, we educate communities, we organize communities, and we engage stakeholders. And this is part of the process. We really do want to hear what's landing, what sounds good. We like constructive criticism, because at the end of the day, we want to move over to the period where we're really doing the advocacy. We want to change things that we think need changing, and we need your support. And so to the extent that any of what we've shared, resonates, any of what we've shared doesn't make sense, I know that we want to connect with you afterwards, because like I said, it goes research, then organizing, then advocating, and then hopefully in the next couple of years, when we pass good, productive laws and policies in the public and private sector, we'll be implementing those and hopefully working with you all again. Next slide, please, Tracy. Great. So before we shift to the actual questions, I do just want to make a quick ask of everybody. If you or the organization you represent in this webinar today are interested in any of the topics we covered, I do hope you'll reach out. All of our info is at ccbuilders.org, and we'd love to connect and work with anyone that's excited as we are about the possibilities of multifamily home ownership. And with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap our formal presentation, get to some of the outstanding questions during the time we have left. So producer Tracy, I think you can stop share.
All right. So thank you, Adam. And please, if you do reach out, you can just call me Alex. Really excited to talk to anybody. I'm hoping that on this call are partners for future work and future research on this area, and I'm just excited that we're excited to be part of this moving forward. I'm going to do a rapid fire attempt to answer all the questions. If I don't get to that perfectly, my apologies, but we'll try to do that offline. So Max asks about the potential downsides. So yeah, we mentioned this. I mentioned this in my talk. Every downside that can happen with any form of property ownership can happen here. There's no system in which people are immune from. There's no housing system where people are immune from the sort of vagaries of climate, of economic change, of our American housing system in general. Just like the foreclosure crisis showed us that a single family home, you can lose everything. Renters can be evicted for various reasons, even under strong rent control. We have all of the problems. And so that's, again, why we talk about in terms of level of support. We're not arguing that this is inherently better. And people are asking about, Max is asking some really good questions about studies to understand and document. And the key in some ways is to providing people real choice, right? There are so many different ways of living in a multifamily homeownership ways. Finding which one is the right one requires a support network that can help you understand the choices and a housing industry that provides the choices, and we have neither right now. And so that's what we're really working on getting to, is to be able to make that real choice, because you have the knowledge and because there's something to choose from. And I think that's good. But these kinds of studies, these kind of like really deep dive and understanding how people are living is really important. Alex's question about reconciling wealth building. Again, the goal here is to be able to make this a choice, right? So that there are some people who are going to want kind of to maximize their wealth building potential, other people who are going to want to exchange some of that wealth building potential for security or for many of the other things. Again, many of it's communal. There's all kinds of other things that people are often willing to exchange for pure wealth building to be able to have. And that should be something that you and your family decide, again, based on real choice, which means you know that the choices are out there and you actually have the financial ability and the technical ability, and there's a market and you can do this. We're not anywhere near there. And I'm hoping, Alex, that again, this is part of our pathway of building a whole lot of different places in this sort of home ownership, wealth building world, and understanding that if we do that people will make the choice, and if we provide people the information, that hopefully that they can make the choice that is right for them. Also, we're hoping at the same time we can make this choice more secure for everybody. America has a system, it says that it supports homeownership, but it constantly allowing people to be foreclosed upon and constantly lose their homes. And so a more supportive homeownership system for multifamily will also benefit, I think, single family homeowners, if that is the right type of homeownership for you. The capital needs, Elizabeth, that's a really important question. Again, there's only, unfortunately, so many levels of detail that we're able to get to in the report about the very specific things. This is a huge issue. And in general, again, one of the things that we've learned through doing this report, and I think many of you know this already, or I've known from experience, is that maintaining buildings is just hard, period. If you are in the home maintenance business, mad respect if you're doing an honest job of it. It's really hard to do. It's hard to do efficiently. People want everything perfectly for nothing. Things break all the time. I mean, housing is constantly breaking the moment you finish it. It's like you don't have to drive it off the lot. And it's not just losing value, but it's actually like, the winds come. And this is really hard. And I think that's, we spend a lot of time talking about home building and not enough talking about home maintaining. And it's not just preserving the structure, it's just sort of maintaining. And that's an area that I think is struggling here as well. Dennis asked about.
Hey, Alex.
Are we at time?
I'm super sorry, because I have a couple questions. I'm gonna do some CEO privilege real quick, because I imagine we're gonna lose everybody. So I have a quick question for you. Serious, of all the policy nonprofits that you've written 100-page multifamily homeownership reports for, what organization is your favorite?
CCB. And just so as a warning, it's 100 slides. It's not 100 pages. If it was
Yeah,
like written
exactly.
like a, it's like
Yeah,
10,000 words. It's shorter than a New
yeah,
Yorker article or an
yeah,
academic journal article, and it has nicer
yeah.
words, thanks to
A-
Bruce.
And equally important, if another group out there wants to work with you on multifamily home ownership, how do they reach out? What's your contact?
You can just, if you Google, if you can spell my name, you can find me. You can read my Substack, which alexschafran.substack.com, which talks about this and all manners of other things. And in particular, I'm going to answer Dennis's question very quickly at the end. The answer, one of the most important agencies for this is our friends Fannie and Freddie. So we're working on trying to sit down and talk to them, not to put them on the spot, but Fannie and Freddie are really one of these core engines of home ownership where they determine to what degree your loans can be purchased by and made into various types of securities. And that's the engine that drives the lending machine. And so right now, that engine is not totally in favor of multifamily homeownership in ways that it could be. Now, we don't want 2006 again. Nobody needs to go back to sort of just open up the floodgates. But figuring out how that engine of financing works is one of the biggest puzzles. And if we have some federal partners on the call and you want to talk about how we do this at the federal level, CaliforniaCommunityBuilders.org, SchafranStrategies.com.
Awesome.
We're here for you.
Awesome. So, and just to say really quickly before we wrap, we will be circulating a recording and notes from this call. So keep an eye out for that email. And then before we really call it a wrap, I do want to shout out the team that put this webinar together, as well as the team that published our report. So first and foremost, my co-host and the report's primary author, Alex Schafran, our producer, Tracy, our other producer, Savannah, and then on the report side, Sylvia Aguilar, Esther Lee Chen, Bruce Merkin, and Michelle Nazal. You're all fantastic. And last but very, very much not least, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today, getting on early, talking multifamily home ownership. Hope this was helpful. I feel like I actually learned a lot. And do keep an eye out for the recording, the transcript, and a very short survey. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Hope to talk to you again soon.